hippie vibe going that they're very proud of, and it was great fun. The students are incredibly curious, have this incredible thirst for knowledge and social impact, and it's actually one of the first places I've ever been where grades are hardly ever a consideration. The students are really deeply interested in how can I change the world and how can I use this class to do it, and it made for an incredible experience for me. So I designed and taught a course on social entrepreneurship and education, and the culminating activity in the class was a Shark Tank-like pitch of their education ideas to the head of Yale's Center for Entrepreneurship. The state of Connecticut had a representative in business development from the governor's office. And we had a couple of other founders of education nonprofits. And 3 of the students actually ended up getting funding for their ideas. And one is a Woodrow Wilson Fellow this year, traveling the world to learn about how to start cooperatives and teaching people how to start cooperatives. She actually designed a model to teach high school and college students how to start their own co-ops. And another young man who already has an after-school program for African-American young men in Tennessee. I think they've served over 60,000 students in after-school programs. Really incredible. During that time, I also wrote a couple books, and I interviewed over 70 thought leaders in education. Because I was in close proximity, I got to connect with some of my contacts at Harvard and MIT in particular, and some other places. And it really helped me, that semester really helped me refine some of my thinking and deepen my thinking around educational innovation in higher ed. And that's really going to drive sort of my talk with you today. So with that said, let me try the share screen, and I'm going to bring up PowerPoint. If one of you can at least let me know if this is showing up, I want to make sure that you can see. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
I see thumbs up. Oh, this is actually really nice. I can still see you guys on the side, at least some of you. So I've kind of renamed the presentation Experiments in Higher Ed, where you might have seen a little bit different title, but it's still the same idea, and I'll get to why. So during my semester, I interviewed people widely in education, not just higher ed, but K-12 education, education nonprofits, education startup companies and businesses, investors in education, and the like. Because a lot of my work is around futures. So the University, Concordia here, is kind enough to allow me to do some freelance work and consulting, and I've consulted with a lot of different groups. Harvard Business Publishing was one of my most recent clients. An economic task force chaired by Madeleine Albright at Markle, the Manhattan-based think tank. And I've worked with a lot of groups around futures. And what I do is I try to help, I analyze current and emerging trends, and I try to help people figure out what's likely to stick and what's not and why. And so one thing that I thought I'd share with you, because I don't do this with many groups, is how do I actually do that work? Because this is actually what leads my decision about what innovations we're likely to invest in at the university and which ones we're not. And these are not just academic innovations, by the way. In my role, I work in almost kind of like a provost type role. So I work with marketing and admissions and student success sometimes, and with academic programming on the instruction side and on the curriculum side. So my work covers across a lot of different areas. And one area where I probably do a little less would be kind of student life. But when I'm looking at trends and developments, these are all of the factors that I take into account when I'm trying to identify trends and patterns. In future studies, there are 2 main camps. There's the one camp that's largely driven by game theory today, and it's a highly sort of technical, sort of stats and numbers driven approach to identifying trends. And I do make use of some of that work a little bit, but I actually come from it on the other camp, which is a more humanities driven camp. So I approach it a little bit more as a qualitative researcher, an ethnographic researcher. So I am looking at language shifts. I'm looking at ways that people start talking about things similarly or differently. I do look at all sorts of different factors, and these are some of them. So let me just pause, and if there's, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but if there's one that just captures your interest and you're like, what in the world does this mean? I'm happy to explain it. And I'll answer a couple, I'll do a couple of them and then give you a chance to request a couple more. One is domain jumping. Sometimes you'll see a development in education, and it's really popular in early childhood education or in elementary education, but sometimes that actually jumps up to higher education. Or you'll see a development in corporate training that jumps over to higher ed, or something like that. And sometimes if you look closely, you can see evidence that something is likely to engage in a domain jump. Level jumping is actually more what I was describing with, like, from high school to higher ed or higher ed to high school. For example, the concept of the flipped classroom, a form of teaching instruction where students watch instructional video outside of class and they come to class to do the problem solving and the work. That actually started in higher education, but it's most predominant in K-12 education today. So it jumped from it started in higher ed and jumped down to K-12. So I look for those kinds of things. Convergence is a really common one too. Many people think that a new technology or a new innovation or policy or way of thinking is going to completely replace an old one. But in fact, what oftentimes happens is a convergence of the old and the new in ways that we never expected. And sometimes people get things wrong because they always think the new is just going to completely eradicate the old, but it rarely happens that way. Usually you get some kind of interesting Frankenstein result. And then there are many others here, but this isn't the main part of my talk. I just want to give you a sense of sort of what shapes the way I approach this thinking. Any of these that capture your attention you wanted me to talk about?
Hey, Bernard, I was going to use chat to moderate the questions, but since you're the host, I can't do that. So people can raise their hands or just go for it.
Yeah, just if you unmute and talk, that'd be the easiest for me while I have the presentation open.
Hey, Bernard, this is Kathy Thunheim at Gustavus in Minnesota. I'm curious about what you would say about revenue potential. I'm just curious.
Tell me a little bit more about your question. What aspect of revenue potential? You mean the one I have on here? Sorry.
Yeah.
So a lot of times there is an innovation that's very promising, and it may actually objectively be the best solution to a problem out there, but there's no clear means of financial viability in the long term. That it's a solution without a source of revenue to fund it and to support it, and without some kind of benevolent, some benefactor or some kind of philanthropic source or government funding or subsidizing of it. It's very likely to fall flat. And so that's one that's really interesting to kind of keep our eyes on. I'm trying to think of a recent one like that. Well, I guess I could give one example would be the free community college model and initiative, right? It's a model that has, some people would argue, well, we're going to increase the education level of students. We have all sorts of positive benefits people might think of, but how do you fund that? And it's completely dependent upon a policy statement, policy commitment on a state, local, or federal level. And so that's where these kind of come together. So if that's an example where it might sound like a really great idea, but it's not financially viable in and of itself. It needs something else to make it happen.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any others?
Bernard, this is Paul Hilmer from Concordia St. Paul. I'm intrigued by the phrase superior but muzzled.
Yes. So this is one also that's related to policy. Is sometimes we'll see a practice that is that's unquestionably in the research and in most people's even just general opinion, it's better. But for some reason, either within an institution, it's muzzled because people in power don't like it, or they have some kind of opinion that's holding it down. Or it happens in the broader education ecosystem where it's superior, but there are lobbyists and other stakeholders who are pushing hard to make sure that it does not get the policy support that it needs. And so they help fight against the laws changing. This is actually one that I noticed as I've consulted with higher ed and other companies. This happens very often in institutions, that there are practices that are superior, but they're muzzled because of power plays that are at work within the institution. Sometimes it comes down even to a single person who fears for their job if it were to change. Like it can often be muzzled out of fear by people internally. They're afraid of the change, and so they strive to muzzle it in whatever way they can internally, or there's too much uncertainty about how it will play out, and that anxiety causes people to fight against it. That's a really, really common one. And by the way, this is not a plug because I have a free version of it I can share with you guys, but I did write a book called Missional Moonshots. It's about, it's kind of like chicken soup for the educational innovator's soul, non-academic work. But I do have some chapters that address many of these kinds of problems that we're going to be talking about. And I'll send you a free copy of the book in PDF form, or I'll send it to Tom and he can disseminate it if he chooses. That does address, like, when you run into a problem like that, when it is being muzzled, how do you actually unmuzzle something in a way that doesn't isolate people too much or something like that. And I have chapters that talk through tips on doing each of these. Any others capture your attention here? All right, I'll answer one because it's usually in the back of people's minds, and then we'll move on, and that's kairos. It's a Greek word for kind of time, or the due time, or the due season. Sometimes in early Christianity, people talk about the idea that when Jesus came, that the growth of the church related to a kairos. It was like the perfect storm. The Roman roadways had been built so travel was more possible than before, easier to travel so people could get the word out. We had a number of different circumstances that all came together. It's a concept of like the perfect storm. All the conditions come together to make it likely to happen. But if even one of those conditions weren't present, it might not grow or spread. Well, that's true when it comes to innovations. And sometimes within our organizations, we have to manufacture our own kairos. Like, we have to figure out what are all of the factors that will most likely result in this success, and how do I help influence those in the right direction in order to get this to take root. From a futures perspective, I'm obviously more just objectively looking out there at the broader trends and saying, are these factors there, or is there a missing factor? And the moment that factor comes into play, I'll start writing about it and telling people this is a trend to watch. This is most likely to pick up. I have an annual on my blog. I write an annual column about here are the 10 trends to watch this year. And the kairos is a big influence on which ones I choose. Sometimes the timing just isn't right. I will say one thing. My timing is getting better, but it used to be horrible. Whenever I noticed a trend that I knew was going to take root, oftentimes I would be 10 to 15 years off on it. Now, the rate of change is so fast that sometimes I notice a trend and it's already taking off in the next 2 to 3 months. It's kind of fascinating. So that certainly makes leadership opportunities a lot of fun. This is one of the quotes that people attribute to Abraham Lincoln, but when in doubt, just claim that Einstein or Lincoln said it, right? So I haven't found the original source for it, but I love the concept, which is the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think as leaders in higher education, we are co-creators of the future of higher ed in our institutions, but also in the larger system. By the models and exemplars and the failures that we have. We're helping contribute to that. And I'm breaking a PowerPoint rule here by giving you such a long quote, but I want to share my bias, just the way I come from, the angle I come from when it comes to educational innovation. And this is a quote from Paulo Freire. It's actually by someone else who wrote the introduction to his book, but in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, this is kind of a classic education text, controversial to some, but he says there's no such thing as neutral education processes. It either functions as an instrument that's used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation, the logic of the current system, or it becomes a practice of freedom, the means which men and women deal critically and create with reality and discover how to participate in transformation of their world. I actually believe that when we start talking about higher education and innovation, it's a highly values-laden effort, that every single innovation that you or I lead in our organization is going to bring about increased access and opportunity and increased freedom. There will be winners and losers, or it's gonna kind of squelch things in some way. And I think that's what, when I talk about the calling of higher education innovation, that's what I mean. That there are ethical dilemmas and challenges at play, and every single thing that we champion will have benefits and limitations to it. There will be winners and there will be losers. And I'm deeply thoughtful and reflective and pensive about that reality as I pursue driving more people to online learning, or trying blended learning, or whether we're going to try a new approach for marketing or recruitment as a strategy. And at what point does the strategy turn into manipulation rather than just informing people? And where do we want to be with that? And I think our Lutheran higher ed institutions are especially well positioned to have those conversations. I'm going to skip a couple of these. And here's another one. People have different opinions of Howard Zinn as some people call him an activist historian. But this is an interesting quote where he says, "Most wars, after all, present themselves as humanitarian endeavors to people." And so the reason I share that is because when we start getting into the realm of being leaders of innovation in our organizations, we can frame it in our own minds as some great, grand, humanitarian, positive thing, but that's not always the reality. So I always believe that it's wise for us to start with a huge measure of humility. And I use this image often to illustrate this. This is an image from the Tour de France, but not the Tour de France in the last few years. It's a little bit older than that, as you can probably tell from the image. Can anyone tell what's happening in the photo? Just go ahead and unmute and say what you see.
Looks like perhaps people are helping someone finish or helping him eat something to sustain him. I'm not really quite sure.
Okay, anyone else?
They're smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, that's what I see, a cigarette.
Yes, so sustenance to be sure, but a little different than what we might expect. So if you look, there's the one guy who has his hand on the back of the other guy, stabilizing him. He's already lit up. He already has a cigarette in his mouth. And then the other one is helping light the cigarette of the third person. So the question, of course, is why in the world would someone be smoking a cigarette in the middle of the Tour de France? And the answer is that if you went back to the journals of the day, the medical journals of the day, and you looked at what people believed about cigarettes, well, it was based in a grain of truth, which is that nicotine is indeed something that can be performance enhancing. But the idea of smoking it isn't necessarily the best for your lungs and for your body. And so they believed with probably, these were very committed, devoted people. They probably believed with all their heart that they were improving their performance by smoking cigarettes in the middle of a race. I presented this, by the way, in Italy. I used this image when I was speaking in Bologna, Italy recently to a group, and there were a lot of humanitarians in the room, and several of them were from France. Or they could just be French. So I thought that was an interesting reply. The reason I like this image, though, I actually have a poster of it, because it reminds me that I can think that I have the right solution. I can think that I know what's best for us, but over time, it may turn out that I was just doing the equivalent of smoking a cigarette in the middle of the Tour de France. And that's why I believe that innovation does really call for a huge measure of humility. Not that we freeze and we don't act and we don't do anything, and we don't experiment and we don't try things, but that we do it in a way where we're humbly and genuinely seeking out feedback on what's working and what's not, and who's impacted and in what ways. It's for that reason, when I first got to Concordia and was challenged to help lead different innovation efforts, one of the first things I did is I blocked off all of my lunches, and I started having lunch with tons of people in the university, every unit imaginable, lots of faculty, and especially people who were critics of things that I would be working on in the future. And I did not meet with them to try to persuade them or to manipulate or anything like that. I wanted to learn and to hear their voice and hear their perspective, and to gain as much insight as I could from them and develop a trusting relationship. And I can say that some of those early conversations actually helped shape and inform my work in ways that I would have never expected. And it made it much better than it would have ever been if I just did it on my own. So that kind of humility, I think, can be powerful. As I approach these, again, every innovation, every technology, every policy, every process, it either amplifies or muzzles something. There's always a value involved. So there's always a give and take here, and that's what makes it fun and incredibly challenging and important work for us, is when we're making a decision to promote something, we're making a decision to not emphasize something else. And I think that that's important. Another thing that I like as I approach innovation in higher ed is so many times we're presented with a problem and we've assumed two solutions. You can either go left or you can go right. And oftentimes when we get most stuck in problem solving in our institution, that's how it's framed. We've framed it as an either or option or a left or right option, choosing between two options, or maybe you could have another road here too. But it's usually based upon our our prior knowledge, our prior lived experience, or just kind of basic logic. And a key to a thought leader in higher ed, in terms of innovation, I believe, is to persistently ask, is there a third way? So if we could actually go straight, right through that tree, right? We could actually go up. We could dig down and go underground, or we could go straight right and straight left. The two roads are not the only options available. They're just the easiest and most known. And that's why it becomes so important. In my own work, one of the most valuable things that I do is I just interview people. I observe a lot of different organizations so that I have a deeper well of knowledge from which to draw. So that when I run into a problem, I'm aware that there are more than two possibilities. There may be 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 possibilities, and that might be overwhelming, but at least the 5 broadens our sense of what's possible. And so that's key. So the analogy that I often use is building a birdhouse. This is a classic birdhouse, and if I ask people, what does it take to build one, you'd probably say nails, wood, a drill, the things that you're shaped, your answer is shaped by the image that I just showed you. I kind of primed your thinking by showing you this image. What if I take you to this slide and I say, what's it take to build a birdhouse? Now that's the power of imagining the possibility. Keep in mind that these are the same, the goal is the same. You're building a house for a bird, maybe a slightly different kind of bird or something like that. But the materials and the resources, there are almost always more options available than what we think of at first. And that kind of creative exercise of challenging ourselves to imagine things differently can be helpful. I actually do this with teams often. I will start and I say, I think that we're stuck in this picture, and I'd like for us to try to get here. So let's revisit the problem, and let's start thinking about other birdhouses we can build. And just that kind of a prime for some initial brainstorming can be really incredible to help add some things to the table that were otherwise not present. Or the other way that I'll do it is I'll say, okay, we're going to rule this out. This is no longer an option. Let's pretend that that's a new constraint. We can't build this one. And then it leads people to think about new birdhouses. Constraints are our best friends when it comes to creativity and innovation. Many people think that you need to remove all the barriers and constraints, and that's when the most innovation happens. But in reality, innovation is oftentimes out of necessity and incredible restraints that leave us so stuck. We either have to just kind of sit there and lose or close, or we're going to have to innovate our way out of it. And so that can actually be kind of powerful. Why is this important? Well, back in 2013, Michael Crow gave a presentation at one of my favorite education conferences. If you've never been to this, it's worth going. It's called the Education Innovation Summit, or the ASU GSV Summit. It's a mix of venture capitalists, education entrepreneurs, and educators and education administrators. Incredible conference that really will challenge you to think in ways you haven't before. But he talked about universities are in 3 main categories. One, you have the elite universities that have such large endowments and such incredible demand for seats in their freshman class that they don't really need to innovate. But in fact, when you go to these schools, they actually do tend to innovate quite a bit, not out of necessity, but because they're curious or they just want to try new things. And this is a reality for those schools with massive endowments. Most of us are not in that position. The second would be the industrial age university, and this is the one that's taken on the policies and practices and procedures and ways of thinking that have been shaped ever since the Industrial Revolution. We think Carnegie unit models and things like that. And he argues that those groups right now are desperately in need of exemplars and what I mentioned before, just getting informed about the possibility. You don't have to act on all the possibilities, just getting out there and learning more about what is possible. And then he argues that there's a third category of university that's really starting to break away from the path because they've built engines internal to their institution to help feed and nurture innovative practices, to help engage in experiments that lead to actionable insights, which I'll be talking about in a little bit here. Let me just pause for a moment and see if there are any comments or questions at this stage before I go on. I'm going to finish in plenty of time for lots of Q&A, but I just want to pause now because I've been feeding you quite a few metaphors and concepts here.
I didn't hear which conference you were talking about. Was that the Education Innovation Summit?
That's correct. Yep. Okay, so let me take a little shift. I'm going to take in a tour of a few exemplars that deal with different kinds of issues in education, but these are going to be from all over the place. And I'll just talk about lessons learned from each. So the first one is a story called A Black Mountain Soul. Buckminster Fuller, how many of you have heard of Buckminster Fuller? Most known for popularizing something called the geodesic dome, which is illustrated in this image. Buckminster Fuller was brilliant and also quirky, and some people considered him a genius, other people considered him crazy, other people considered him both. Fuller was certainly avant-garde in terms of work in kind of visions around architecture, but did a lot of other things. And in fact, this was his life goal. He was ready to take his own life and believed that he had kind of a spiritual awakening experience. And at that point, he determined to make his life an experiment to find what a single individual can contribute to changing the world. And he was known for meticulously documenting every one of his actions and behaviors, everything he ate, everything he did. And there's still like tons of journals, like stacks and stacks of journals about his life. And eventually, Buckminster Fuller actually became a visiting professor at an interesting school that emerged in 1933 through 1941. This is the building for what became Black Mountain College, which was one of the earlier experimental colleges. It was informed by the Bauhaus movement coming from Europe, and it was kind of a design school of sorts. And they didn't have traditional classes. It was more of a studio art kind of feel. Very creative, lots of mentoring between the professors and the students, a model that is used in some of the alternative colleges in existence today. But this one lasted up through 1957. They moved over to this facility, and then it closed in 1957. And then, completely unrelated, jumping to the present, near present, in 2001, Sugata Mitra published his first article called Children and the Internet, Experience with Minimally Invasive Education in India. What he did is he went into poor parts of more urban or populated areas in India, and he literally put a computer into a brick or concrete wall and connected it to the internet, and essentially left and just came back to observe to see what students did with this technology. And from that emerged a theory called self-organized learning environments. And he discovered that simply giving students the power of connectivity and having groups of students around a device, that they would actually co-create learning experiences. And they could even learn things about microbiology as like middle schoolers and other kinds of topics. In fact, everything was in English, and these kids didn't even speak English. These were students in areas that did not have schools. And so he developed this intriguing theory based upon his hole-in-the-wall experiments. And in 2013, the Technology Entertainment and Design Conference recognized him with an award for his work, and it became very popular. His talks became very, very popular. Well, there were a group of 20-somethings that were listening in and inspired by his work, and also realizing in the very building where Black Mountain College once existed, they decided that they wanted to try an experiment in higher education. And they called it, after Sugata Mitra's idea of the self-organized learning environment, or SOUL, they called it the Black Mountain Soul. This is imagine a college without courses, credits, degrees, programs, or professors. That's what it was. Essentially, people could apply and they could get in and they would have a mentor and they would self-organize. They could actually get a degree from another university, like an online university, but live there. People could come and start businesses. Students could pitch their own classes and start them. If you've ever seen the comedy movie Admitted, in some ways this was a little bit like it. It was a fascinating experiment, and it certainly is extreme. And some of us might look at this and think, this is crazy, this is extreme. But this is representative of a trend in education. Self-directed learning is gaining a lot of traction because we know that it's important. That the connected age allows students to Google and test and challenge professors in ways that they never could before. That access to raw content is readily available for free. You're not bound to have to be in a class, but if the mentoring and the like is often in the class. But even then, people can kind of self-organize their learning. So this is an extreme case representative of a trend that we're wise to pay attention to. In fact, there was a community college that created a self-directed learning center at their community college, Bunker Hill Community College, I think it was called. And students could actually get credit for sort of self-organizing certain learning experiences. And then they had other classes that were more traditional. What's interesting about this one, though, is it failed. Not that interesting. Maybe you expected that. It failed, but it didn't fail because of the education model. It failed because it was a bunch of 20-something that came to live together, and they found that they were more interested in partying with one another than going to school. So it failed for the same reason that some of our freshmen fail. But it's an interesting experiment. Again, I pointed out because every one of these highlights something for us to keep our eyes on. This represents the broader trend of democratization of education. These three images represent three different kind of developments historically. You can think of bands as a time when you would go into a town and there'd be the carpenter's shop and the blacksmith's shop and the baker's shop, and they were all independently owned, and you would kind of barter with one another for things and the like. And then we developed more kind of a kingdom approach to things. It became more hierarchical leadership, and there's kind of a top-down model of reporting. And what we have now in the digital age is we have more examples of people where there is no clear leader at the helm, and people are co-creating learning experiences. And that's how learning is happening outside of school a lot. So what's intriguing to us as we think about the current state of higher ed is that in many of our institutions, faculty are living on the left, administrators are living in the middle, and students are living in the right, which makes for some interesting challenges and opportunities. So to give you an example of kind of another innovation that went a different direction, in Austin, Texas, there was a owner of a construction company who had a very specific dilemma. He was hiring people who were high school grads, and they would work for him, and he wanted to move them up to leadership positions, management positions, but found that they lacked some of the critical thinking skills and the leadership and the communication skills necessary to really do the work of that manager or that leader. And so he really had a need. Now, if you guys are involved in corporate partnerships and the like, you may know that that's a very common need and common problem out there. So a group was drawn together, and they created a nonprofit organization called Peloton U. If any of you are cyclists, you know that a Peloton it's the group of cyclists that kind of come together and they help each other and help each other achieve a goal. And so essentially what it is Peloton decided to create an environment to help adult learners come back to school and get their degree, and also get some clarity around career goals and things like that. So what they did is they created kind of a shared workspace, and they did not create their own college. Instead, what they did is they found the competency-based schools online, like Western Governors and Southern New Hampshire, And Peloton simply got students to come, and they pay like $1,500, and every student had to commit to be in the shared workspace for 15 hours a week. And they were each assigned a mentor advisor who would help them with their coursework, who would help them with career goals, who met with them every single week. They were meeting with their mentor. So really close, intimate relationships. They helped them with study skills, they helped them set goals, and they would go online and they would pursue these degrees. Along the way, they studied to see which programs were the most effective and which weren't. They drive a lot of them to Southern New Hampshire because they get the best outcomes from Southern New Hampshire now. And so what's so interesting here is this is a model of unbundling of higher ed. Now we see an example of an innovation that's we're wise to watch, because outsourcing in higher ed is bigger than it's ever been. For example, I'm one of the only people in more traditional liberal arts colleges to have built a team internally, a full resource team to start and launch and run online programming. It's really odd to do, and it's probably not even wise for many institutions to do that if they want to start online. Many times they contract out and they outsource to other people. So all of a sudden, where it used to be the university that did everything, now you have one organization doing student support, one organization doing recruiting, one organization doing marketing, one organization doing the teaching and the learning, right? And so it's a kind of unbundling and rebundling of things. And I think Peloton is a good example from the entrepreneurship realm of how that's happening. And it's a fascinating opportunity for innovation in our organizations to look at where is unbundling and partnering makes sense, and where does it not make sense? Where might it be prohibitive in our institutions? I think that we are in the age of partnerships. That we never have all the smartest people in our organization, as much as we like to believe that sometimes. And so partnering and collaborating with experts from different organizations, I believe, is going to be more important than ever. Hopefully, we'll even be able to do it with one another. Who ever thought of higher ed institutions actually collaborating with each other? But it's a novel concept with great promise. Another story I'll tell you quickly of another startup that's interesting innovation practice is a company called Promazo. And you'll notice that each of these are driven by a problem, because that's how innovation is launched. There's a problem that kind of drives us to it. This is one that was about, this was for kind of elite schools that want to place their graduates in top organizations. And we have top organizations that really want top students. And it costs them a lot of money to recruit those students. Tens of thousands of dollars to recruit new students. Some can spend $30,000 to recruit a new student. And it's pretty expensive. It's even prohibitive in some cases. And so this alum of Notre Dame University and a couple of others got together, and they decided that they were going to create a startup to address this. Essentially, they created an internship company, but it's a little bit different. The way Promazo works is they'll build relationships with Fortune 500 companies. One of their first partners was Whirlpool. And they met with Whirlpool, and they said, what is a project that you're going to outsource anyway, something that you need to work on, that we can help you address? And Whirlpool said to them, well, we don't know how to market our products very well to millennials. We need to figure out a strategy around how to best, what do millennials think about our products, and how do we market to them? And so Promazo then will go to one of their partner higher ed institutions, and they will post on the job board in that institution a series of jobs in order to assemble a team. Promazo will hire the students. They're paid by Whirlpool, but they actually hire them, so the students work for Promazo. And the students get a paid virtual internship. And Promazo will provide a project manager who leads them through this work. And the students and they'll hire people that have math or stats backgrounds. They might hire an English major to help with the copy editing or writing or some other piece. They hire business students, different students from different disciplines. They assemble the team with all the skill sets that they need in order to accomplish this task. They take students through detailed training, so they get to learn how to engage in this kind of teamwork and how to work for a Fortune 500 client. The students develop these skills. They get to put it on their resume that they worked they solved a problem for a Fortune 500 company. They actually, pitched their solution to the company. And the company gets to watch all of these students and look for the top talent that they might want to hire, so it saves them money in the recruiting and the hiring process. really intriguing model. And some universities say, well, why can't we just do this ourselves? Well, most universities don't have the resources to do all of this partnering. And in some cases, it benefits to build a team of students from across multiple universities. So their current partners, I mean, they're developing real world skills, they're graduating with experience. You get to experiment with more than one career because they could do multiple projects over their career, their tenure at the school. They discover the relevance of their coursework. So this was actually an interesting discovery of students in stats actually understanding why stats matters because they had to solve a real world problem with it. Discover current strengths and limitations personally. Learn how to work on a team and build connections. Current partners include Harvard, Boston College, Carnegie Mellon, Notre Dame. They've added some more universities. They're planning to expand it. And they work with top companies like Whirlpool and IBM. The students get paid. And again, Pamazo handles the coordinating. So some really fascinating kind of experiments. I'll take you through, let me see, time-wise, take you through one more. I had a few more in here, but this one is totally different. This one's called Tilt Factor. This is a oh no, I got to give you two examples. Sorry. Tilt Factor is a university-driven research think tank on the use of games and game design to solve social problems. And I am convinced that game design will be a huge influence in the future of higher education. Not games like playing Mario Brothers or our vision of video games and the like. These are really carefully constructed games intended to change behavior and beliefs. And they have what's interesting about Tilt Factor's examples is they've actually had very specific public health outcomes from having people play a game for 30 to 60 minutes. For example, there was a lot of resistance to the idea of vaccinations in certain populations, and they were concerned that it could be a public health epidemic if they didn't encourage people to get vaccinations. So they created a game where students, it was like a card game actually, where people would sit down and they would make decisions, and their decisions would result in the death or the life of their neighbors based upon whether they got vaccinated or not. Because with vaccinations, we know that the people impacted the most are those with immune deficiencies or something like that. So it might be children next door to a home. Their parents don't believe in vaccinations. They don't get their kids vaccinated. Those kids mow the lawn for the elderly neighbor. That elderly neighbor is highly susceptible to illness, and it's the neighbor who dies, not the child, right? And so they actually have a game that sort of simulates those kinds of situations. And they could change people's beliefs and behaviors about vaccinations within 60 minutes of playing the game. Then they did something interesting. They added zombies to the game, and they actually found that the outcomes were greater. Go figure. And then they moved it into a video game, on a mobile device game, and the outcomes declined to almost no influence. And they believed that it had to do with the social interaction during the game. So I'm pointing this innovation out because this is something for us to keep our eyes on, and maybe even to explore what are the opportunities for game design and gamification, whether you are in academics or marketing or admission or student life or advancement or whatever else. There are applications here that are intriguing. You don't have to agree with them all, but again, my challenge is just for us to get informed about the possibilities. We don't have to like or embrace all of the possibilities. I'll give you one last one. I said that was going to be the last one, but this is my favorite, so I have to share it. This is one of the newest colleges in the country, in the United States, called Wayfinding Academy. It was a professor at Concordia University, Portland, and she was frustrated with students going to college, getting into huge debt, graduating, and not knowing what they want to do with their life. She told one story of a student whose father was a firefighter, his grandfather was a firefighter, and he wanted to be a firefighter. But he was paying $20,000 plus a year to go to college because that's what you're supposed to do. That's the definition of success. So he went to college, he graduated with $60,000 to $80,000 in loans, and then he became a firefighter. And she thought, you know, something's not right there, something's missing. Not that there wasn't a value of a liberal arts education or something like that, but from her take, she felt like that was a problem. I'm not necessarily saying I agree or disagree, but I'm telling you her story. And so she said, I'm going to start a new and different kind of college. It's a 2-year college where everyone graduates with an associate's degree in self and society. And the first 2 years are focused on getting to know yourself, your gifts, talents, abilities, callings, passions, strengths, weaknesses. And then society is getting to know what are the needs in the world and in your local community and in society in general. They flip the experience where essentially at the beginning, instead of doing all the liberal arts classes, they have liberal arts like classes, but immediately in the first quarter, the students are getting out into the community and internships. And by the time they're done with 4 years of college, they will have done, 4+ different internships, exploring different possibilities. Every faculty member that teaches at Wayfinding Academy has to be deeply embedded and connected in the Portland community, so that when students say, I'm passionate about beer making, they know 3 people they can connect them with. And then they do incredible trips all over the world and the like with the students. They actually issue their diploma to the students on admission. It's not an official diploma, but it's like a fake one to symbolically represent that they're flipping the college experience. So they actually travel out to the home, to the door of every student that they accept. And they knock on their door and they greet them with their diploma. And that's how they know that they're accepted into the program. Of course, that's easy to do when you have a first class of 13 or 15. And so they're doing some really novel things. If you want just an interesting model of what's happening in higher ed and the experiments in higher ed, Wayfinding Academy is good to check out. The other thing is it's a good example of a micro college. We're going to see more of these pop up in the upcoming years. We'll see schools of 100, schools of 50 popping up, and then just shutting down when there's not demand for them anymore. Also, we'll see more higher ed institutions creating colleges within colleges, a school within a school model, where you could have a niche, an unusual experimental kind of curriculum and model where the students go through it as a cohort, and it's insulated from maybe the rest of the university or college cultures. Or it's like a half and half, where they get to be part of their living and learning community, and then they're also part of the larger campus. So I could take you through a whole bunch of others, but I wanted to kind of conclude and do some Q&A around where I think this all leads. One, I'd like to suggest that getting informed about the possibilities is one of my suggestions as we think about being innovators, which I've talked about before. But a second is I'd like to make an argument for each of us thinking about how we can engage in experiments in our organization. During my sabbatical, I had a chance to talk to Michael Schrage, author of The Innovator's Hypothesis. He's at MIT. And Michael Schrage has dealt with lots of Fortune 100 companies and Fortune 500 companies as a consultant to help them build cultures of innovation. And one of the things that Michael has come to believe is that good ideas are bad for organizations. But the idea of getting people together in a room and you all brainstorm and you collaborate and you commiserate with one another, and the most influential person says yes or no to an idea. But the most influential person may be completely wrong. And you go with it because it's a chain of command kind of thing. And we've even heard stories of that, of tragedies with pilots where there's the pilot and the co-pilot. And because of the chain of command and the relationship, the co-pilot had insight that could have saved the plane, but didn't give it and just went along with what the pilot said. Well, I think that we're not necessarily being honest with ourselves if we ignore the fact that that happens in all of our organizations all the time. And for that reason, just a good idea in and of itself isn't necessarily always the best route forward. Instead, what Michael Schrage argues for, and it's also modeled in the business world in a book called The Lean Startup, is something called a testable hypothesis. So anytime you're gathered with a group of people and you have an interesting innovation or idea that you would like to try, the challenge is, how do I take that idea and quickly turn it into a testable hypothesis? Let me give you a recent example from my own work. I was talking to a group of, we were concerned because we had some online courses and we had faculty who were not being very responsive to the students' work. So students would submit their work and it was taking too many days for the faculty to give feedback to the students. Well, we know from research that that's one of the key factors for student dissatisfaction, student disengagement, and student dropouts in online courses, is if there is not strong rapport and strong, frequent, meaningful feedback from the instructors. So this is a problem we had to address. So people came together, and initially, when they started brainstorming, they said, well, yeah, this is a problem. We need to just mandate to faculty that they should give feedback within 48 hours. Good luck. If you're in higher ed, you know mandating something to faculty is is not necessarily, it's easier said than done, right? And it doesn't change behavior or beliefs overnight just because we created a mandate. And people had other ideas like that. But they were all ideas. We didn't actually know what would improve or not, help or hinder the issue. So instead, I shifted the conversation. I said, how can we create a series of short experiments that give us actionable insight on what will work? And it changed the whole nature of the conversation. Someone said, well, what if we sent, what if we can actually track how frequent faculty are giving feedback. So what if we created a email that automatically went out once a week, and it kind of scored faculty on, congratulations, your response time to students is this week. And then underneath it, we can have a sort of positive, like a norms, social norms theory kind of thing, a positive statement about feedback. And what if the automated message just went out once a week, and we could measure and see how that changed faculty's behavior. And then a couple of other people had different ideas on completely different strategies. And yet we turned them into a hypothesis. Essentially, if we send them a weekly announcement with this data, that will improve their response rate. And we did it with 3 different experiments. We conducted the experiments. We got actionable insight, actual data on what changed behavior and what didn't. And based on that, we iterated and we created a second set of experiments. And we're actually still in the process. Once we're done, we will have the best possible data about what changes faculty's behaviors in a positive way. And people are most favorable to. And we will have a practice that will probably launch university-wide, right? So as opposed to us just kind of launching some big thing and then doing an autopsy later, these experiments can be lifesavers. And pilot is my favorite word. It used to be my favorite word, and now experiment is my favorite word, or testable hypothesis. In fact, what I'm doing is I'm actually, on the academic side, I'm going to fast forward. Sorry, I put a bunch of extra slides, I didn't know how far we'd get. I'm actually doing this with academic innovations now, where I'm starting teams of faculty in these different categories. And the whole purpose is these are faculty who are intrigued either from a research perspective or from an improved teaching and learning perspective in one of these topics. And they're going to join in academic innovation teams, and we will be responsible for creating experiments that we conduct in order to gain actionable insight on best practices with virtual reality in a health sciences classroom or in a biology classroom or in whatever it might be. And I'm super excited about this new this new experiment. I'm trying to do it also with some of the other units, not the academic units. So I'm going to be assembling a variety of teams to kind of move forward with this right now. Now, I wanted to get done in ample time for lots of Q&A. So So I had extra slides if it's completely silent, but I'd prefer to not do them. I prefer to just have a really great conversation now. I'm going to stop sharing, get back to where you can see me and I can see you. And Tom, if you want to switch over and take over again, I'll figure out how to do that. And then if you want to broker the Q&A, that would be great.
Well, Bernard, why don't we just go ahead and give it a try? If folks have questions, go ahead and raise your questions. And Bernard, you go ahead and choose.
Okay, sounds good.
We'll work our way through it.
Questions or comments that emerge? I know you have them, so I just love for you to be willing to share them.
Bernard, this is Paul again. I'll give it a try. One of the tremendous challenges, I think, for small private tuition-driven institutions, as we're looking for that way to remain relevant in the marketplace and remain meaningful in a student's educational experience, is to figure out what the great sort of market-based innovations are that bring students in, but may not have the greatest educational payoff. And of course, the opposite of that, maybe the ones that are educationally beneficial, but may not necessarily have the market payback that we're looking for.
Tell me a little bit more what you're thinking about with market. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I think particularly when we're in an era where it's about online, it's about making it as convenient as possible, it's about short online experience as opposed to longer face-to-face experiences, dealing particularly with busy adults, but it could just as well be undergraduates who have to work.
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot between being convenient and affordable, but not compromising so much on educational delivery, I think can be a challenge.
Yes. So the testable hypothesis approach can be a really interesting way to go about having that conversation internally. Because what I found in having that conversation is that there are a lot of beliefs about what is academically sound and what is not, but we don't actually dive into the research or test out our beliefs to see whether or not they're valid.
Mm-hmm.
For example, course length is a common one. What are the affordances and limitations of a course length of 15 weeks versus 8 weeks versus 4 weeks versus 6 weeks? And are there certain populations that actually achieve greater outcomes with a shorter course than a longer course and the like? To be able to ask those questions together and not assume an answer, we may find that these shorter courses are academically inferior and inconsistent with our values as an institution. We choose not to go forward. But the benefit of doing it through these experiments and through this kind of hypothesis approach is that we learn something. We actually gain insight, actionable insight that helps us move forward one way or the other, whether we choose to move forward with one of these alternative delivery models or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think in some cases those decisions have been made already. And so whether we can take a step back and indeed engage in an exercise that allows us to do the testable hypothesis may yet to be determined, but it's definitely worth a try.
Yes, so here's the other approach. The other approach, when the decisions are already made, that's actually a role that I play. And I'm not suggesting that I would be the person for your organization, but I've done this for like elite schools. For example, there was one elite school. It's funny how some of them even have you sign non-disclosures. They want to keep it so private. But one elite school was considering adding MOOCs, massive open online courses. And the faculty was very opposed to adding MOOCs, even though it was for non-credit and things like that. And they had all sorts of opinions and beliefs about MOOCs and why they didn't want them to happen. They pretty much made up their mind. So I was invited in and to give an Imagine the Possibilities presentation. And all I was doing is giving a neutral presentation of 8 different models of MOOCs at different institutions, what they're doing, why, and what the outcomes were, both favorable and not favorable. And all that it was doing was deepening their well of knowledge about the subject so that we could have more sophisticated conversations and move forward from there. And so the Imagine the Possibilities approach can actually be really helpful as well, to just start the conversation. And then if there's enough interest, that might spark enough interest to then move to the experiment stage.
Great, thank you.
What are your other comments or thoughts or questions or ideas that are mulling around in your head?
So besides your blog and the Education Innovation Summit, what other resources might we use to stay ahead of some of these innovations? Because I'm in the School of Education and things are changing so fast, even in the K-12 world, we can't keep up.
Yeah, so if with your specific background, I would say a great source you can sign up for their newsletter and they stay very current about things happening would be EdSurge, EdSurge. They have a K-12 newsletter as well as a higher ed newsletter. EdSurge they write some great reports. I'm not saying that just because they quote me in their articles sometimes, but I know them and they're doing great work. They're actually top journalists from New York Times and other places that wanted to focus on education, and they're brought together in the Bay Area, and they're doing some great work. So that's one that I'd suggest right away. If you're comfortable with social media, I actually learn about things on Twitter before anywhere else sometimes now, believe it or not. And it just takes time to kind of search for who are the people to follow. It's, and I can maybe give a list of people to follow. I might even put that on my blog or something, people that I follow and why. They're also, these are not very academic. People don't think about them academically, but I do have a blog post you could search for. Just do ETALE, and podcasts. I put an article on the 10 podcasts that I listen to and why. And these are things you can listen to on your way to work and back. If the reason I mention social media, newsletters, and the like, as opposed to the more academic sources, is because this is just where you get introduced to the idea. You can always dig deeper, and that's actually where I try to add value. Is I learn about it at these places, but then I'd actually dive into the scholarly research, or I conduct my own research to kind of provide a deeper understanding of the subject. But those are some initial places. I would also say, I mean, since you're in the education space, the International Society for Technology and Education has, a massive conference, and that's always a great place. Not even the sessions. Go over to the bloggers hangout and just meet people and talk to them, and you'll find some incredible stuff. And then, there are a few, I guess I'll stop there because I could go on and on about ways to stay connected.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bernard, this is Kathy at Gustavus again, and my Action Learning project is about innovation. So I have identified, or I will be identifying 3 schools to go visit. Yours is one of them. What 2 other schools, kind of like, 4-year liberal arts, would you recommend that I take a look at? 2 or 3? Who off the top of the head do you admire?
What are the areas of innovation that most interest you? Tell me a little bit about your role.
Yeah, right. So I'm a business management professor, a former entrepreneur, and I have this new role of helping lead the strategic plan. And my boss is a former VP of Research and Development at Medtronic in the Twin Cities. So she's a business person, and she was an innovator, right? She did all sorts of patents. So the observation she's made about our institution in her 4th year, and by the way, she's raised a lot of money here, and she's going to raise more. She says, we don't use terms here like continuous improvement processing, innovation. So I think the interest is, how do we introduce it? How have other institutions introduced this? How did you do it? So that we don't threaten, intimidate, scare our faculty. So academic innovation is very important. We have no graduate degrees here. We have no online. I mean, we are 4-year residential liberal arts. So we are at the very beginning,
Yeah. So first one that comes to mind, given everything you've told me, is Indiana and Wesleyan University. Yep. I think that would actually be one that might be really intriguing for you. Okay. They're one that kind of comes from a traditional kind of residential undergrad, and they have very successfully expanded across different delivery systems and models, and some really interesting. Their president, I'm really impressed with the way he thinks and works. So that's one that comes to mind. A lot of the others, because I enjoy getting into the really extreme examples. I like learning from groups that are not like me, not like our institution a lot. So that's kind of like, Antioch College is kind of an alternative classic work study college. It's the innovation from the 60s and the like, but it'd be a really intriguing model to kind of look at. The thing I like about them is because they have sort of a series of strategic goals for the university, strategic plan, and they actually have a VP in charge of each goal. So the president has literally structured themselves around their strategic plan in a very interesting way. So that might be kind of an interesting kind of angle. Then you could also do some that maybe are very unlike you, but could be fun and a very different model, like Southern New Hampshire University, where you could actually visit and see their traditional campus and look at the tension between their traditional campus and their online and their competency-based units, and see what they had to do in order to innovate. You'll learn about a model that we actually used, and it was hard, and we did get resistance, and it was not all positive, but we actually used the silo approach. I'll mention a book, Clayton Christensen's Innovator's DNA, a great classic book on innovation. He popularized the idea of disruptive innovation. But one thing he talks about is sometimes when you're pursuing an innovation, you have a charge to do it, that you have to insulate it from the rest of the culture in order to protect it from being sort of subverted or muzzled, as I talked about before. Yep. But that does come with a cost. You're isolating yourself, and you're going to get some people not so happy with what you do, and so it can hit the culture a little bit. And I've had to do that at times. Candidly, there was a plus and minus. I had to go into it with my eyes wide open, but we had good results. We went from a few hundred to 3,000 online students in 5 years. So, and we did it with a tenth of the budget of the big schools. So, but we had to insulate it from the rest of the university. So Southern New Hampshire is an interesting example of a school that's done that recently. So there's a few that come to mind right away.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Bernard, this is Bobby Swan from Concordia, Portland, and I'm actually heading out to SNHU next week.
Great.
To do some field research. And when you're talking about that tension between the campus and online, can you just toss out a couple of names of individuals you think I should meet with, and can I drop your name?
So I did professional development for the Southern New Hampshire University faculty this summer, and I've completely forgotten all the names. So I will go through if you send me an email, I'll go in my inbox and I'll look back at all of them. But there's a gentleman that I met there, I had dinner with, who is, I think he's sort of like a chancellor. He's in charge of the online continuing unit. I love the way he thinks. He's an incredible leader, very clear, good visionary, has some earth-shattering kind of ideas that might be coming down the pipeline. So I'll give you some of those names if you email me. But there's also, if you're going to look at the Southern New Hampshire model, I'm on the EDUCAUSE's Leading Academic Transformations Task Force. And one of my colleagues on that task force was in charge of the CBE program at Southern New Hampshire, and now she's at Capella. And she will give you an interesting perspective as someone who was there and is not now. She'll speak favorably about it. But we should talk offline. Maybe just set 20 minutes and we could talk about some of this in more detail.
I will do that. I have just one follow-up question that I think that applies to everybody. When you talk about the superior but muzzled, we have a tension that we can't control, and that is the Department of Education. And so one of the things that I see happening is some of our innovative conversation, whether it's course length, program design, so on and so forth, can really butt up against this third-party restraint that we can't control. We are trying. We put a group of experts on our campus together in a room for 2 days this week to try to come up with some out-of-the-box ideas of how to structure online and on-ground courses and program links to help with enrollment reporting, which is becoming huge on campuses. The Department of Ed's main goal right now is to shut schools down, and so how do you deal with this issue on your campus where we want to be innovative, we want to be thinking about these new ideas, but we can spend a tremendous amount of time doing that and then find out we cannot deploy them with any type of student aid. So just a couple of minutes on that, or any resources for us to look to.
So there's so many ways I could approach that. So I launched the first online master's degree program, competency-based master's degree program in the country built around digital badges. We did it here at Concordia. I contacted the Higher Learning Commission, the Department of Education, asked them about it. They had no clue what I was talking about, so they said, yeah, go ahead. And then competency-based education got popular. And they realized, oh, wait a second. No, we can't just say yes to this. We have to analyze the heck out of it. So they then reached out to us after the program had been running for over a year. And they said, we need to do a review, a complete review of your program. And they asked for documentation. And we put probably 80 pages of documentation together and went back and forth and we had to revise it 4 times because they couldn't even understand what we were talking about. And because most of these people looking at it are not even academics in this case, and there was some academic nuance to it, or I don't know where they were coming from. But anyway, it was incredibly painful. And after 18 months of a review, they said, yes, you can keep doing what you're doing. Now, the part that's intriguing about that is that the reason that it was so complicated for them, I thought that I was being innovative and working around the DOE. What I did is I started with, what are all of the constraints given to me by the DOE? And I wrote them out, literally. These are the constraints. These are the 7 things that I must do in order to comply with what would be expected by our regional accrediting body and by the DOE, right? And then I challenged every single constraint until it was truly at its bare bones, because oftentimes what we do in academics is we overinterpret the way things are written. So sometimes I may talk to a program director who said, we must have 3.5 faculty members because of this. And when I actually read the laws and the rules and I ask for clarification, that's not actually what it says. There's more room there than what they thought. And so I got it down to the bare bone constraints. And I built the whole program initially based upon those constraints. So for example, ours is what's called a course-based, competency-based program. So it fits within existing credits. I have credit equivalencies for every competency and badge, which is typically not done in competency-based education, and all sorts of other little nuanced pieces. And so it met every single one of their parameters. But they were so used to just looking at these very simplistic models that where they could just kind of say yes or no to it, they were stuck. So I'm babbling a little bit, but I'm sharing this because I can relate. And I believe that one way for us to do this is there are a few approaches. One, we can start with the constraints when we innovate so that we know that at the beginning, and it's not frustrating that we come up with this great idea and afterward we're told no. Two, whenever possible, if we can get voices involved from that unit. So for example, if you're doing competency-based education, we're members of the Competency-Based Education Network, and there were only 20 universities allowed into it, but now we've opened it up to anyone. Join the CBIN. They're a wealth, and they have people who've worked on the DOE, and they can, and they can do this work. But it's an incredible, that's probably most of the work is building those relationships externally and getting buy-in and teaching people what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it. So I don't know. Those are some of my initial thoughts. I will also say this. I'm being recorded, so I'm really hesitant because I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist now. I wrote some strong critiques of the DOE about 2 years ago about this very topic. And that year, our university was audited by the DOE for the first time ever. And then the DOE also forced the Higher Learning Commission to come back and review that creative program that I designed. And then I got personally audited by the IRS. And I can't help but wonder if, I'm just saying, it is a reality. And maybe maybe those are all coincidences or something like that. But I did become a little bit of a conspiracy theorist when 3 things happened in a 12-month period right after I became outspoken about this. Sorry, that doesn't help. That probably scares you more than anything.
No, thank you for the warning.
So I would say soft gloves are much more appropriate. But relationship building is much better than the route I went and publicly criticizing them.
Bernard, thank you for all this. This is Sonia Hagener at Augsburg University. I get to say university. We've just gone from college to university. You're aware most definitely in the ELCA seminary system and the colleges and universities, the major transitions that are taking place and the innovation and the need for critical innovation. How do you look at the personnel changes? How do you accompany those that are critical in innovation? And many times those are, frankly, losses, right?
Yeah.
What's your way into that kind of work?
So I'm going to make sure I understand what you're thinking about with personnel changes. Are you asking about whenever you get to that point where you realize you have to make personnel changes in order to engage in the innovation, or people who leave because of the innovation? Like, which angle are you thinking about?
Both, actually.
Okay.
Both.
So I did a study of 100 innovative learning organizations a number of years ago, almost 7 years ago. And the question that I was asking in all my interviews and all my observations was, what are the traits of the leaders who are most effective in creating incredibly innovative learning organizations? Ones that are distinctive. And a number of traits came up. One of them is that they tend to focus on 2 or 3 what I call unavoidable, undeniable school shaping concepts. So they don't try to innovate like all over the place. They pick a few areas where they really major in and they focus on them. And they kind of riff off of those few to create all sorts of different innovations, which is important because that's something that you can get greater buy-in for. if you're innovating like 50 different ways and you're going all over the place, I've made that error as a leader myself. I'm so excited about so many different things that I can overwhelm people and they don't know where to go and they'd like to get on board, but which thing do they get on board with? I'm going this direction, then I'm going the other, and then I'm going all over the place. So I think as leaders, we can be more clear and focused on the innovations that are highest priority and focus on those. And that can help to get more buy-in, and it makes it more manageable for people to come along with us and to transition, right? So that's one thing that I discovered in that study. There were a couple of other things, though, that I think are important. One, every single one of those leaders had a tough-mindedness to them. That doesn't mean that their personality was always like that they were tough, they were really like blunt or anything like that, but tough-minded in that they have, once they were really clear about their values and their school-shaping concepts, if there were people that they were looking to hire and those people were not on board with those 2 or 3 school-shaping concepts, doesn't matter how talented they were or what other positive traits they had, they would pass on them. And in the same way, if they found that they were moving forward in this direction in the institution, and there were people who were directly opposed to or resisting the idea after persistent efforts to try to get them on board, they would consistently make the decision to have the conversation about whether there's not a place where they would be a better fit, where their gifts might be better suited. And many of them did that in really wonderfully graceful ways. But the other thing that happened is as they built this culture, and they really picked a few things to get everyone on board for, the culture itself started to shift the personnel so that some people would actually self-elect out, where they would say, hey, this just isn't for me. I'm gonna have to pass on this. And I realize, especially for us in faith-based organizations, sometimes we use the metaphor of family for our organizations. So it's really hard to think of it. And if you use a family metaphor, I mean, the thought of saying you don't belong to this family, that's horrible, right? I mean, that sounds terrible. But that's why some leaders prefer the concept of a team metaphor, because on a team, it does matter your performance, and it does matter whether or not you're on board with the goals of the team. And those things do make a difference. And I think that metaphor is sometimes a little more helpful. I'll do everything I can to get people on board and to help them. But if in the end they're not, I think that's a trait of a strong and innovative leader, is we're going to have those hard conversations with people and encourage them to look elsewhere. Or we're going to have to sacrifice our goals.
Amen.
I'm going to just, Bernard, if it's okay, ask for a final question. Well, if I could ask for 2 favors, Bernard. One, you mentioned about moonshots in a PDF. If you could send me that.
Will do.
Then I'll get that out to folks. And then also the slides.
Yes.
And I'll get those out to folks too. And then Bernard, I need to catch up with you either by phone or by email here today or tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good. I will send you over the Moonshots PDF in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks a lot. And Bernard, thanks again as always. We love having you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. If I can be helpful in your projects or anything along the way, especially if you're interested in doing some of the experiments or something, please feel free to reach out to me. I love doing that kind of thing, having those kinds of conversations.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard.
Thanks, Bernard. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Wow. Fabulous. Wow. Great.
We'll, and this did get recorded, so we'll have 3 things: the recording, the PDF, and then the slides. And I'll just get those out to you all as he gets those to me.
All right. It's good to EC everybody.
It's great to see everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
I know.